Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, and government leaders. We meet each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome New York Times op-ed page columnist Gail Collins to the program today. Her columns give us insight into the foibles and machinations of our politicians in such a witty and good-humored way that they are never taken as mean-spirited. And in her latest book, When Everything Changed, The Amazing Journey of American Women from 1960 to the Present, published by Little Brown, she helps us gain perspective on both how women and men have evolved during the last 50 years, and does it with scholarship and in her own unique style. Not only does she answer the old question, did feminism fail? She poses new questions about the past and the future. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Gail, as you know, there have been other books written about the history of women in America and about the history of the of the women's movement. I remember Marcia Cohen's book some years ago, Susan Brown Miller's sort of personal history of her involvement in the women's movement, and Barbara Berg came out with a book just very recently. Why did you want to write a book on the subject or another book on the subject?
Well, you know, my journey, as we like to say, began back with the millennium, and what the Times was doing, a whole issue of the Times magazine on women over the last 1,000 years. Took only one issue, but still, they asked me if I'd write the introduction. And that was really the first time that I thought about the fact that you had a vision of women's limitations and what their place in society was that had existed for 1,000 years, and that it broke down in my lifetime, and that just so completely knocked me out that I wanted to write about it. So I wrote America's Women, which I thought was going to be the history of American women, but it was like one of those social studies classes you take on the history of America, and it's June and you're only on World War II. You know, I was on World War II and it was page 500, so I just sort of wrapped it up, and I knew I wanted to come back and do this book, which was the one I was planning to do all along. And to tell it from the ground and from the top so that you could see the big moments that were happening, the demonstrations and the lawsuits and the laws, but you could also watch it from the ground, from the way it affected regular women. And my researchers and I interviewed about 100 and something different regular women around the country. And we asked them what they wore and what kind of dolls they played with and how they dated and job stuff. And that was possibly the most fun of the entire thing.
Okay, so 160 women that you interviewed. How many researchers who helped you with
Well,
this?
I can't count. There were a bunch of them. I would just sort of go around different parts of the country and find really good graduate students, and then just give them demographic ideas. You know, find a woman who was a housewife in the 1960s and who never worked, or something like that. A lot of them interviewed their relatives, which turned out to be fine. And they were all different, and they all had these great stories. And you could just see most of these women were not into movement stuff or feminist stuff or whatever, but you could just see how much the stuff on the top was affecting their lives and the way they were thinking about themselves and about the world.
Now, you tell your book, I mean, you use the stories of these individual women, and some of them are women that everybody knows, and some are the women that, you know, most people have not heard about. I'm interested in how you found women like Unita Blackwell, Lorena Weeks, Pat Lawrence, Georgia Panter Nielsen. Was it through these researchers, or?
No, those were all mine, actually.
Okay.
A couple of them, actually, like Unita, I didn't interview. She wrote a great memoir. And I have to tell you that I did find, when I was especially doing the civil rights chapter, I really believe that people who've been through some amazing thing, as the years go on, don't actually remember it anymore. They remember the stories that they've told about it.
Right.
And so after going through a bunch of people, I did interview, of course, some people about it, but I really did find that those memoirs that were written right after the fact, you know, were much sort of juicier and had a flavor that it's really hard to recapture. So that was really important to me too. And the others I just sort of found, you know, Georgia, who was my, she was my prototypical stewardess. And the stewardesses are a huge bunch of heroines in this book in the early years. They were just, you never think about it, but they were the spear carriers, really, of the job employment discrimination suits. And I got her through one of the stewardesses unions. And Lorena Weeks, who was my very favorite, who brought one of the very first suits that was critical for now was beginning to fight to try to end job discrimination. There were all these laws that were allegedly protective laws.
Right.
You can't.
Now, was she the one who worked at Southern Bell?
Yeah, and like many of them, I find, like Lily Ledbetter, she was a working class Southern woman, and she just knew what a woman's life really was, and that you had to work, that there was, no way around it.
Right.
And, the whole thing was it was not a principled thing about, great cosmic constitutional principles for her. It was very basic. She and her husband wanted to send their kids to college, and she wanted to make more money. And the job that she applied for did involve pushing on a dolly this thing that weighed about 35 pounds. And she had picked up a typewriter every day of her life and put it on her desk, and that weighed 40 pounds. But they said, no, this was,
not to mention picking up children.
Not the children, yes.
Right.
The idea that you can't pick up anything that weighs more than 30 pounds when
right.
you're toting around, twins or whatever is just crazy. But she fought. She was a lovely, lovely lady. I really enjoyed talking to her.
So much of the discriminatory laws and regulations, as you said, were supposed to be protective. I think a long time ago, one of the arguments for women not going to medical school or law school was that carrying those heavy books would, just throw your uterus out of joint so you wouldn't be able to bear children.
Yeah, and there was a guy, the head of the dental school at the University of Texas, said that women could not become dentists because they weren't strong enough to pull teeth.
Now, Ella Baker, was one of the heroines in your book, and she was one of my favorites. She's an older woman who was one of the founders and certainly one of the supporters of SNCC, which was, one of the essentially a student group during the civil rights movement. But she was, I guess, the mother of SNCC.
SNCC would not have started without Ella Baker.
Tell about, and I guess I liked her because she was older and she wasn't cute and sexy, and because the men gave her a hard time, and yet she just hung in there with the students.
That's what she said very bitterly about the men in the civil rights movement.
Right.
Well, of course they didn't like me. I was older. I wasn't attractive. I didn't have a PhD. Well, how could they care? But she was an organizer at a time when women did not travel, but she went around the country. She was a very middle-class Southern gentlewoman from a gentlewoman's family, and her family was just broken-hearted that she went off on this bizarre journey instead of becoming a teacher like you're supposed to if you're a middle-class black Southern woman. And she worked for the NAACP, and she would come into towns, and they would be horrified that they were getting stuck with a woman instead of the NAACP stars that they were hoping for. And then they'd be so thrilled because she was so into her philosophy, was so into the idea of letting the community rise up and listening to the community and letting the community become the leader, the grassroots people, which is a very humbling kind of way to do civil rights because you're not really directing, you're taking direction from all these people. And that was the way she taught the SNCC kids to behave and to think about what they were doing. And there was this brief shining moment with SNCC in the South, in particularly Mississippi, but throughout the South, when you had all these young people sort of living together in this, brotherhood, the beloved community, as they called it at the time, black and white, rich and poor, and risking their lives every day, and this just sort of ecstatic experience that so many of them were happening. And of course, stuff like that can only last for a few years. You can't really carry that on forever. But for a moment there, and that was her vision. And it turned out to be a vision that was too hard to carry through. It was just much easier to have charismatic guys running around leading marches.
Carmichael,
and, and then as people got tired of doing it, as they got exhausted from the violence and the struggle, they dropped her ideas and became the Stokely Carmichael SNCC instead.
You make the point that the modern women's movement grew out of women's outrage over how they were treated by men, primarily in the anti-war movement. I remember what Dorothy Day, of the Catholic worker movement said about, how that movement started just from people sitting around talking. and you start hearing people's grievances and their experiences, and you realize that you share these, and you said, well, we've got to have a movement eventually.
I think we got something going.
I mean, and that's
guys.
how that's also how the women's movement started. Certainly, how the civil rights movement started. If you had to peg one moment as the beginning of the women's rights movement, what do you think it was?
I'd have to give it to that moment in Washington when Betty Friedan was passing around her napkin. There'd been a lunch. The great thing that happened was that when they passed the Civil Rights Bill, and the women's movement was totally lifted on the back of the Civil Rights Movement. I think, it never would have happened so quickly if it hadn't been that the Civil Rights Movement was there making everybody very conscious of unfairness, no matter where it was. And when the Civil Rights Bill passed, some of the Southern representatives tossed in an amendment saying it also, the job discrimination section also applied to women, which they regarded as a huge joke. And maybe we're trying to derail the bill. Maybe had some hope it would get complicated. But some of the women figured this out and really jumped on it and got it through. And then the women hadn't been thinking about this at all. I mean, at that point in 1964, the most progressive, aggressive women were thinking maybe someday they'd have like a study commission on whether this should happen. It was nothing on anybody's top of their agenda at that point. But once you got it, once it's sitting there in the law, naturally everybody thought, well, okay, here we go, guys. And they were shocked when it became clear the government didn't intend to really enforce it. And there was a meeting of all the various commissions on status of women in Washington, and all these women were there anyway, and they were grumbling about this, and Pauline Murray and Betty Friedan and some of the other women got together in Betty Friedan's hotel room, and they yelled a lot and fussed a lot, and Betty Friedan locked herself in the bathroom for a while. It must have been a really interesting meeting, but at the end of it, they decided that they were going to demand, in their meeting the next day, that Johnson do something about this and enforce the law. And their motion was declared out of order, and they were very ticked off then, and they sat there at their table while everybody else were making their speeches. They passed around napkins, and they all signed up that they were going to have an NAACP for women. They would do what the NAACP did, collected a little bit of money, and that's how NOW was formed. And NOW, although it was the most disorganized thing in the entire history of the world, just all these women from all over the country, just sort of glommed onto this idea. There were demonstrations, even though there was no NOW, really. There was just this sort of moving around thing. And they started filing lawsuits, and that was really the beginning of the movement.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Gail Collins and I will be back after the following message.
Horseradish. Is that for horses? Remember me, Mr. Lobster? From last Tuesday? Banana. 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 Here comes the rain. We need a hat. And why do we need a hat?
If they jot.
That's right.
When you talk with your child, you build vocabulary, and learning starts long before school does. For more tips, go to bornlearning.org.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, talking with New York Times op-ed page columnist Gail Collins. Her latest book, When Everything Changed, The Amazing Journey of American Women from 1960 to the Present, has just been published by Little Brown and Company. Let's go through some of the prominent players in the women's movement that you talk about in the book. And if you could just summarize briefly what you feel was their contribution to the movement. We just talked about Betty Friedan, who wrote the book and started it all, on the back of a napkin. Helen Gurley Brown.
Helen Gurley Brown actually came at exactly the same time, really, at that early 60s period as Betty Friedan. And like Betty Friedan, she figured out, I don't know how much of a seer she was, but she just captured something of the moment that nobody else had expressed before. In her case, the beginning of the destruction of the double standard that had always existed, in which men were supposed to have sex and women were not until they got married. And basically, for the first time said, look how glamorous it could be to be a single woman. And you can have affairs, and you'll have a job, and you'll have a nice apartment, and you'll have friends, and it'll be so neat. It was sort of the way Playboy had been talking about men, all
Right.
the single bachelor life
Right.
all this time. And she created that for women, and that had never been thought about before. It had always, always, always been presumed that the only happy women were married women. And then suddenly, Helen's got this whole other vision, which was popping up to the surface anyway, but nobody had ever articulated before. It was a very big deal.
One thing I really found interesting about Helen Gurley Brown, she was so realistic when she talked about her life in particular and how she, you know, being, you know, not particularly attractive, mousy, a mouse burger she was, going from a mouse burger, and how a mouse burger is able to capture David Brown as a husband. She's so realistic, you know, and talking about her own life and what the realities are for women. But then in the magazine, Cosmopolitan is totally totally fictionalizes women's lives. You know, you can, if you buy this expensive lingerie that we advertise in the magazine, then you can catch your secretary.
Well, there is always the advertiser thing going on there. That's true.
It's interesting. Gloria Steinem.
I thought, you know, there was that long period in which there was this Betty Friedan versus Gloria Steinem thing, and kind of the pitting of the two together, because when Gloria Steinem came on the scene, the media in particular lost interest in Betty Friedan, who was sort of sharp-featured and middle-aged, and Gloria Steinem was young and beautiful. Right. She was just gorgeous. And it seems so clear to me that the movement needed both of them, that when it was getting started and all women were just terrified of, you know, saying anything, speaking out, you needed somebody like Betty Friedan who was out there kind of banging away. And then as it took over and started roaring and scared the hell out of everybody, you needed someone like Gloria Steinem, who, although she was very radical, always sort of packaged her thoughts in a very soothing kind of way, you know. So when you were talking about, you know, whether women, you know, should be mothers, there was all this strident stuff going on about, you know, motherhood is slavery and so on. And she just said, well, you know, opera singers are such a wonderful thing, but everybody is not supposed to be an opera singer. And it was just so everybody gets their piece, everybody gets their respect. And it was so important to young women to have the message that you could really look good and find great guys and also be true to your sisters and carry the flag forward, because although many of the great thinkers of the women's movement thought that one of the important things was to eliminate that whole attractiveness thing and makeup and hair and silly shoes with high heels, it just turned out it was not going to work.
Right.
It was not going anywhere. So you just had to give up on that one. And Gloria Steinem was a wonderful sort of synthesis of the two things.
Bella Abzug.
Bella Abzug took the, I mean, you know, Gloria Steinem said about her, she was like the first woman that she ever met who was totally not worried about looking like a lady, acting like a lady. She just went for it. And she took the whole thing into the whole political arena in a completely different way than you'd ever seen before.
I remember, and I remember her very well, covering her when she was around. And then she also had the best funeral that I've ever been to. Everybody was there, and it was so much fun. And somebody, I think it was one of her daughters, played the guitar and sang "My Yiddish Mama." It was fabulous. What were the laws that did the most to move the women's movement along?
Well, the Civil Rights Act and the anti-discrimination law was huge. You know, if you look, there is this tiny, tiny period. You look at the 1960s, and it could be the 1850s, really. The early 1960s, it's perfectly legal to tell a woman, oh, we don't hire women for that kind of job, or oh, we don't like to promote women because it doesn't really help if the men get supervised by a woman. It's perfectly legal to say if you want credit, you have to get a man to co-sign your credit, which just drove women nuts sometimes. You couldn't buy a house by yourself. You couldn't serve on juries and some stuff. I mean, just incredible stuff. And then suddenly, within a couple of years, between that 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1972, all that stuff was gone. Congress passed laws, Title IX, which was huge as it turned out.
Forbidding sex discrimination in education.
Yes, which turned out also to be the sports thing, which
Right.
was way much a bigger deal than anybody imagined at the time. You know, even Sarah Palin talks all the time about how Title IX gave her the opportunity to play basketball. It was a very big deal. Credit laws are taken care of. And that was one of the reasons I think that the Equal Rights Amendment in the end didn't get passed, because once opposition built to it, when it came to the question of what it was going to do, you know, all the people who've been fighting for it since 1920 had never conceived of the idea that you could get rid of all those discriminatory laws without some big all-encompassing amendment. Well,
Right.
it turned out they were almost all gone by then. It was
Right.
very hard to come up with stuff, non-symbolic, not big picture theoretical stuff that the
Right.
ERA was going to do.
Right.
So
right.
when Phyllis Schlafly came bounding around saying, "Oh my God, we won't have Girl Scouts anymore. You know, we'll have unisex bathrooms. There won't be any child support. Yada yada yada." None of that was true, but it's hard to argue against stuff. And they couldn't come back with anything like, "Yes, but we will do this or that." It was all kind of vague and amorphous. The only big specific they could come up with was, "Yes, women will be drafted," which really didn't thrill and excite the masses
Right.
in any big way.
Right. But it was interesting, you talked about the unisex bathrooms, because, you know, when you were talking about these debate over these laws and about over the ERA, you know, the argument always came around to something really trivial, you know, like, you know, with men and women having to share the, you know, the same bathrooms. Or I remember I had an argument. This was Jeff Greenberg in a class, and we were talking about, you know, this is when churches and religious organizations were trying to go to sex-neutral
Right.
readings, and hymns and whatever. And we were talking about, you know, and he was talking about, it would be terrible if you changed something like, you know, "in our Father's house," and our Father meaning God. And I said, well, how about now "in God's house"? I mean, wouldn't that be, wouldn't that
No,
be
it would be
pretty?
different.
Wouldn't it be simple to do that?
Can I tell you my unisex bathroom
Yes,
story? This
you
was
can.
like the only moment. I had very few moments of principle when I was at that age, but I was in Hartford in the early 70s, and we were stuck in sort of the overflow press room, which was in the attic of the state capitol. And there was nothing else up there except this sort of little room where the legislators drank with the lobbyists, called the Hawaiian room. They had a pipe with some Lay's thrown over it or something, but and they were all guys. And there was only one bathroom up there. And, you know, we were working until midnight, 2 o'clock
Right.
in the morning. So we just sort of appropriated the bathroom, put up a sign saying, "This bathroom is for men and women, be careful, knock." And the next day we came back, and some legislator had seen it and had a big sign up saying, "Men only." And I found a law that said there had to be a bathroom for handicapped men and women on every floor. Mm-hmm. So there was nothing for handicapped women. So I brought this to the attention of the people who ran these things in the Capitol. And the next day I came in, and there was a big sign that said, "This bathroom is for men and handicapped women only."
At which point you affected a limp and started
Yes,
to
well,
use
I
it.
thought, well, at least this taught me something about politics, if not about sexism.
Barbara Berg, who wrote a recent book about what's happening with women in the country and sexism, was here a few months ago. And in her book, she said, it's called On Sexism in America, Alive and Well and Ruining Our Future. She found that there is a renewal of sexism in national politics, in jobs, on the internet, in major TV shows, in our most intimate relationships, such an unequivocal resurgence of sexism in this country that it should be called nothing less than the sexism of mass destruction.
She's worried, I can tell.
I don't think I didn't get that from that you felt that way from your book.
No, I don't. I think feminism worked. And it's absolutely true that there are many, many challenges, more complicated challenges, because they're not strict legal issues anymore. The problem of what to do with kids when everybody is working is just, you know, huge. And for women, the tension between that, you know, family job thing is, I think, the biggest single thing that holds women back. But every once in a while, you just really should step back and say, my gosh, in my lifetime, you know, when I was a kid, you know, you couldn't wear slacks anywhere.
Right.
That was a very big deal. But, you know, you couldn't get credit. My first credit card I still have. It says Mrs. Daniel Collins on it. You know, you couldn't You couldn't get credit. You couldn't buy a house. You couldn't get all kinds of different jobs. You couldn't go to dental school. You couldn't, all this stuff. You were totally living a life different from that of men. You know, there were a few heroines who really came through it, but they were always regarded as these strange lady lawyer or whatever people. And that all changed in my lifetime. And most college students are women now. I mean, there are terrible, terrible problems, but young girls do not grow up thinking that their lives are going to be different from guys' lives. They don't think that they won't have adventures,
right?
That there's
right.
stuff they can't do. That's huge. That's
yeah.
just amazing. And that every once in a while, you just got to sit back and think, wow.
And I think your book makes the point that, you know, we really have come a long way, baby, even if you don't smoke Virginia Slims. So I want to thank you.
It's a pleasure.
We're out of time. And again, I'm thanking Gail Collins for joining me today. When Everything Changed, The Amazing Journey of American Women from 1960 to the Present has just been published by Little Brown and Company. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.